October 1910. A one-room schoolhouse on the edge of a quiet Kentucky town. Children's voices carried across the fields high and bright, while smoke curled from the chimney where a pot simmered. To any passerby, it looked like the picture of small-town innocence. But history has a cruel way of hiding its darkest truths in the most ordinary places. And here, behind a blackboard and a smile, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. They said she was kind. They said her stews were rich, filling, unforgettable. The children adored her for it, bowls scraped clean before lessons even began. But whispers began to spread, soft at first, about townsfolk who went missing, about meat that didn't taste quite like beef or pork. No one wanted to believe it, yet the unease lingered, like the smell of something burning faintly beneath the sweetness of bread. This is Shadows of True History, the place where the bravest come to face what others would rather bury. Tonight, I ask you, do you have the courage to hear what really happened in that Kentucky schoolhouse? Because once you know, you'll never think of a warm bowl of stew the same way again. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, so we know just how far this investigation has reached. Now, I want you to picture Kentucky in 1910. Life was slower, harsher, shaped by the rhythm of the land and the weight of tradition. The town where our story begins was small, just a scatter of homes, a church, a general store, and the one-room schoolhouse that served as both classroom and community hub. Dirt roads stretched out like veins through endless fields of tobacco and corn. Families worked hard, prayed harder, and trusted those few figures of authority who kept order: the preacher, the sheriff, and the schoolteacher. Most families lived hand to mouth. Children walked barefoot to class, carrying tin lunch pails, or, more often, nothing at all. A hot meal at school was a rare blessing, and that's why the teacher's stews became legendary. On cold mornings, the scent of onions, root vegetables, and slow-simmered broth greeted the children before they even sat at their desks. It was comfort, security, and nourishment, all in one pot. For parents scraping to provide, it was one less worry. But here's the thing about small towns. You could measure every heartbeat, every secret. The rhythm of life was predictable, and so were the faces you saw day after day. When someone went missing even briefly, it left a gap as sharp as a missing tooth. People noticed. And yet, in 1910, suspicion was often silenced by politeness or by fear of stirring trouble. Women were expected to be caretakers, teachers especially, and to question one was to question the very heart of the community's trust. So the schoolhouse stood there, with its pot always steaming, its door always open, and its teacher always smiling. It looked like a sanctuary, but in truth, it was the stage for one of the most unsettling mysteries the town would ever know. Her name was Miss Margaret Halloway, though everyone in town simply called her Miss Maggie. At 36, she carried herself with the calm authority of a woman who had long ago learned how to command respect without raising her voice. She wore her hair pulled tightly into a bun, her spectacles perched low on her nose, and her dresses always pressed and modest. To the children, she was both stern and tender, a teacher who demanded proper handwriting, but also the first to press a warm bowl of stew into their hands when their stomachs growled. Parents trusted her in a way that went beyond the classroom. In a community where education was often considered a luxury, she was seen as both protector and provider. Miss Maggie cares for them as if they were her own, mothers whispered with gratitude. Even the sheriff, a man not easily swayed by sentiment, often remarked that the town was lucky to have her. But let's be honest for a moment. When someone is placed on a pedestal that high, isn't it easy to stop looking too closely? Isn't it easy to ignore the small oddities, the quirks that don't quite fit, like how Miss Maggie never welcomed visitors into her home, despite living just a short walk from the schoolhouse, or how she seemed to have no family, no siblings, no parents still alive, and certainly no suitors. She was, by all appearances, married to the school and her cooking pot. At first, these details seemed harmless, even admirable. A woman dedicating her entire life to teaching the next generation. That's the kind of sacrifice small towns built statues to honor. But in Margaret Halloway's case, those same details were the camouflage. They were the carefully woven veil behind which something darker waited, hidden in plain sight. Every villain needs a mask, and Margaret Halloway's was stitched together from kindness, duty, and tradition. To the outside world, she was the devoted schoolteacher who went above and beyond for her pupils. Her pot of stew, always simmering, became more than a meal. It was her signature, her way of showing love. "No child of mine will learn on an empty stomach," she used to say, her voice carrying both pride and conviction. And in a place where hunger gnawed daily, those words carried the weight of salvation. Parents adored her for it. They told themselves she was simply practical, stretching meat and vegetables into a meal that could feed 20 hungry mouths. If the flavor sometimes seemed unusual, they chalked it up to her special recipe, an old family tradition from somewhere back in her past. No one dared press her for details. After all, who questions the woman feeding their children when they themselves could barely put food on the table? Even the children played their part in reinforcing the illusion. They would rush home and chatter about how Miss Maggie's stew was thicker, richer, tastier than anything their mothers could make. Their innocence became her strongest alibi. What mother, already struggling with guilt over empty cupboards, would accuse the one woman who managed to nourish her child better than she could? The cover story was airtight because it was built on gratitude and need. Who would look too closely at the hands that fed them? Who would dare to suspect malice behind the ladle when the stew smelled like comfort and survival? It was perfect camouflage, the benevolent teacher, the endless pot, the smiling face. And yet, just beneath that surface, something was simmering that no recipe book could ever explain. Now, I want you to picture her little house, standing just beyond the schoolyard fence. From the outside it looked ordinary, whitewashed boards, a pitched roof, lace curtains yellowed with age. But step inside, and you'd notice things that didn't quite belong. The kitchen was too large for a woman who lived alone, its shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, strange spices, and cuts of meat preserved in ways unfamiliar to most. The chopping block bore scars too deep, too frequent, as though it had endured years of relentless work. Behind the house was the root cellar, dug deeper than most, a dark hole in the earth with walls slick from damp soil. Neighbors assumed it was for potatoes and apples, but in truth, it was a vault, a place where the teacher stored what could not be left in plain sight. Heavy lids kept prying eyes from seeing, and the iron lock on the cellar door was unusual for such a modest home. People noticed, yes, but explained it away. After all, a woman living alone had every right to be careful. Her infrastructure didn't end there. The schoolhouse itself became part of her design. A small storeroom adjacent to the classroom was where she kept sacks of grain, flour, and barrels of broth. But children whispered about the smells that sometimes drifted out, smells that weren't entirely pleasant. She always brushed it off with a laugh. "The stew will taste better once it's simmered long enough," she'd say, turning the incident into a harmless quip. It was a system built piece by piece: the kitchen, the cellar, the storeroom, and the unquestioning gratitude of a hungry town. Every structure, every detail, served as both tool and shield, and it allowed her secret to survive far longer than anyone could have imagined. Strange things always leave traces, but in small towns, people are experts at smoothing those traces over. Take, for example, the odd smell that sometimes drifted from Miss Maggie's kitchen. A tang that wasn't quite beef, not quite pork. Parents would wrinkle their noses, exchange brief glances, then let the thought slide away. "She probably bought meat from one of those traveling peddlers," they'd say, eager to return to the comfort of believing all was well. And when a man from the next county vanished after passing through town, no one linked it to her bubbling pot. People preferred simpler stories. "The roads aren't safe," they said. "Bandits must have taken him." Or, "He ran off to start a new life. Happens more often than you'd think." These explanations were flimsy, yes, but they were easier than suspecting the smiling schoolteacher who fed their children. Even within the schoolhouse, there were oddities. Children claimed they saw stains on her apron that looked darker than gravy. One little girl swore she found something hard in her stew, something like a small bone, but Maggie scolded her for telling tall tales, and soon the story was laughed off as childish imagination. Adults clung to that dismissal because it protected them from the unbearable thought that the child might be telling the truth. It's important to understand, this was an era when questioning authority carried weighty consequences. A schoolteacher held a sacred role, and accusing her would mean accusing the very system of learning and care that the town depended on. So the whispers were muffled, the doubts swallowed, and each time an oddity surfaced, the townsfolk reached for the easiest explanation, because sometimes denial feels safer than truth. No crime of this scale survives without someone looking the other way, or worse, helping it along. In Margaret Halloway's case, there was one man who seemed to linger just at the edges of her story: Thomas Green, the town's butcher. To most, he was a quiet, unremarkable figure, a widower who kept to himself and spoke only when necessary. But his shop was the only place where cuts of meat came and went without question, and his hands were always red from his trade. Thomas was often seen delivering sacks to the schoolhouse early in the morning. When asked, he explained they were donations, trimmings and scraps meant for Maggie's famous stew. Folks nodded approvingly. How generous of him, they thought, how community-minded. But what if those sacks contained more than leftovers? What if they were part of the machinery that allowed her pot to bubble endlessly, even in weeks when families swore no livestock had been slaughtered? Some whispered that Thomas and Maggie shared a peculiar understanding. She, the solitary teacher with her pot; he, the butcher with access to blades and storage. No one questioned. Their alliance was invisible, but effective. He gave her the cover of legitimacy. Of course it came from my shop. And she gave him the quiet companionship of shared silence. The hardest truth is this: the collaborator doesn't always need to be as cruel as the villain. Sometimes it's enough to be complicit, to find reasons not to see, not to ask, not to stop what's unfolding. Did Thomas know the full extent of what Maggie was doing? Perhaps not, or perhaps he knew and convinced himself he was powerless to stop it. Either way, his presence in her story raises the most chilling question of all. How many crimes survive because someone close by chooses to keep the secret alive? To understand the weight of this story, we need to stop and remember the people who disappeared, not just names on old town records, but flesh and blood souls with dreams, flaws, and families. The first whispers concerned travelers, drifters, peddlers, men looking for work who passed through the valley and never reached the next town. They were easy to forget because no one truly knew them. Their absence could be explained away. But soon, the pattern began to creep closer, into the town itself. There was Mrs. Eliza Turner, a widow who often came to the schoolhouse to sew clothes for the children. She was known for her laugh, sharp and bright, the kind that carried across the fields. One day, she failed to return home. Her neighbors said she must have gone to stay with distant kin, though no letters ever arrived to prove it. Then there was Daniel Price, a farmhand who sold eggs to Maggie on the side. He vanished after delivering a crate to her kitchen door. His employers muttered about him running off with wages owed, but deep down, they doubted it. Daniel was steady, dependable, a man who didn't run. And let's not forget the children's whispers, the way some of them said they recognized the taste of the stew, as though it reminded them of someone they knew. A terrifying thought, isn't it? That a missing neighbor could return not in flesh, but in flavor. These were not faceless strangers. They were neighbors, helpers, voices that once filled the rhythm of daily life. But poverty, pride, and fear wove a veil around their disappearances. And so the victims, one by one, slipped into silence, until the only trace of them left was the uneasy satisfaction of a full belly. Every dark secret eventually brushes against the wrong set of eyes. In Margaret Halloway's case, that moment came one gray November afternoon, when the rain turned Kentucky's dirt roads into rivers of mud and kept most children home. Only a handful attended school that day, their lessons shortened so they could return before dusk. With the room nearly empty, Maggie dismissed them early. then returned to her kitchen to tend the pot simmering in the corner. But one boy lingered. 10-year-old Samuel Whitaker, a quiet child with a habit of staying behind to sweep the floorboards. His mother had begged Maggie to watch over him. He was frail, easily sickened, and she trusted the teacher's stew to give him strength. That day, as Samuel bent to gather chalk from the floor, he heard a sound, a low thump, as if something heavy had been dropped in the adjoining storeroom. Curious, he crept closer. Through the crack of the door, he caught sight of Maggie struggling with a burlap sack, its contents unmistakably human in shape. Samuel froze. For a moment, his young mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps it was firewood, perhaps a mannequin for lessons. But then, the sack shifted, and an arm slipped out, pale and limp, with fingers bent at impossible angles. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He backed away, heart hammering, until his heel struck a loose board, and the noise betrayed him. Maggie's head snapped up. Their eyes met, hers wide, not with guilt, but with something colder. Calculation. She smiled, the same soft smile she gave when serving stew, and said in her gentle teacher's voice, "Samuel, curiosity can be dangerous. Best you run along home." He did. He ran until his lungs burned, until the schoolhouse was a blur behind him. Yet the image of that sack, and the calm in her voice, would haunt him for the rest of his days. For Samuel Whitaker had seen what no child should see, the truth trying to escape its own prison. When Samuel Whitaker burst through his family's door that night, his mother thought he'd been chased by wild dogs. His face was pale, his clothes streaked with mud, and his hands shook so violently he couldn't untie his boots. Between gasps, he tried to explain about the sack, the pale arm, the look in Miss Maggie's eyes. His words tumbled over one another, desperate, tangled, almost incoherent. His mother listened, clutching his shoulders, but as his story unraveled, her expression shifted from alarm to doubt. "Samuel," she said softly, "you've always had an active imagination. Maybe it was a rag doll, or a log. You know Miss Maggie would never harm anyone." The boy cried harder, insisting, but the more he pressed, the more his mother hushed him. For in her heart, she couldn't reconcile the trusted teacher with the horror Samuel described. To believe him meant tearing open the fabric of safety she'd wrapped her life around. In the days that followed, Samuel's behavior grew strange. He woke from nightmares, screaming about burlap sacks. He refused to eat the school stew, shoving bowls away even when his stomach growled. Classmates teased him, and Maggie, ever calm, told the children, "Poor Samuel is unwell. His mind plays tricks." The town believed her, of course. She was steady. He was just a fragile boy. The cruelest part? Samuel began to doubt himself. Trauma has a way of reshaping memory, especially in the young. Each denial from adults, each chuckle at his wild story, chipped away at his certainty. Maybe it really had been a doll. Maybe he had let his fears conjure shadows where none existed. But deep down, in the silence of the night, he knew what he saw. And knowing made him carry a secret heavier than any child should bear. When whispers began to ripple through the town, half born from Samuel's frightened outbursts, half fed by the quiet unease of missing neighbors, the elders could not ignore them entirely. In small communities, rumor travels faster than fire, and to maintain order, some kind of inquiry had to be staged. But in truth, the town did not want the truth. It wanted reassurance. So a committee was formed, the sheriff, the pastor, and 2 merchants from the square. They visited the schoolhouse on a crisp morning, arriving with notebooks and solemn expressions as though they carried the full weight of justice. Margaret Halloway greeted them with the same soft smile she gave her students. She invited them inside, ladled steaming bowls of stew, and set them before her investigators. The rich aroma filled the air, masking the iron tang that only Samuel remembered. The men asked polite questions. Where had she been on the nights so-and-so went missing? Maggie answered with calm precision. She was always home, tending to her lesson plans or preparing meals for the children. Had she seen anything suspicious? No, but she, too, had heard the rumors, and they saddened her deeply. Her voice carried such sincerity that even the sheriff lowered his eyes, embarrassed to have doubted her. They glanced briefly through the storeroom, but the shelves were neat: sacks of flour, jars of beans, stacks of kindling. The burlap sack Samuel swore he saw, gone, perhaps destroyed before dawn. The men exchanged quick looks, then wrote notes that sounded official, but carried no weight. By the time they left, their bellies were full, and their consciences soothed. That evening, the sheriff told townsfolk, "We found nothing amiss. Miss Halloway is a blessing, not a threat." The pastor echoed his words from the pulpit the following Sunday, and just like that, suspicion was swept under the rug. For the town PRs preferred a comforting lie to a shattering truth, and Maggie knew it, knew how easily fear could be dressed in gentleness, how quickly doubt could be smothered by a warm meal and a steady voice. If suspicion was a spark, Margaret Halloway smothered it with skillful hands. She knew that lies could not stand alone. They needed scaffolding, carefully built, reinforced with gestures of kindness, strands of half-truths, and the loyalty of those too frightened to question. After the inquiry, Maggie began weaving her web more tightly. She visited the sick with baskets of bread, sat beside grieving widows, and wrote letters of condolence when neighbors vanished. "The world is a cruel place," she'd whisper, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, "but we must care for one another." Her words carried such weight that they silenced doubt before it could grow. In the schoolhouse, she doubled her devotion. She praised children for small efforts, tucked extra biscuits into their lunch pails, and slipped coins to families struggling to buy coal for winter. To many, she became indispensable: the teacher, the cook, the comforter. Her goodness was spoken of so often that it became part of the town's identity. To question her was to question the very fabric of their community. But lies are not merely told, they are maintained. Maggie kept careful records of her activities, logging times, dates, and even imaginary visitors, so that if anyone asked, her life appeared transparent. She encouraged gossip about strangers passing through town, subtly shifting suspicion toward outsiders, and whenever children like Samuel grew uneasy, she bent low, her voice tender, assuring them that dreams and fears often twist reality. In such moments, her calmness felt more convincing than truth. Behind closed doors, though, the mask slipped. Neighbors sometimes caught glimpses: Maggie hauling heavy bundles into the cellar at odd hours, or smoke rising late from her chimney. When asked, she laughed lightly. Preparing lessons, trying new recipes. The excuses fit neatly, and no one pressed further. Piece by piece, her web stretched over the town, until it caught not just her victims but her protectors too. And by the time anyone felt the threads tighten, they were already entangled, unable or unwilling to break free. Every liar, no matter how skilled, eventually falters. For Margaret Halloway, it began with something small, so small in fact that most would have dismissed it. But as with a thread pulled from a garment, once loosened, the entire fabric threatened to unravel. It was a late autumn afternoon when Mrs. Abernathy, a farmer's wife, knocked at Maggie's door. She came not with suspicion, but with courtesy, bearing a jar of blackberry preserves. Maggie, flustered from some unseen task, welcomed her in. The kitchen smelled of stew simmering on the stove, as it so often did. But this time, the scent was different, stronger, unfamiliar, laced with something metallic beneath the herbs. Mrs. Abernathy wrinkled her nose and asked lightly, "Trying a new cut of meat, Margaret?" Maggie smiled too quickly, her answer too rehearsed. "Venison," she said. Yet the Abernathys were no strangers to venison. They had eaten it all their lives, and what drifted from that pot was not venison. The woman said nothing further, but when she left, the unease clung to her like smoke. A week later, another moment. During lessons, Maggie misplaced her composure. Samuel, the same boy who had glimpsed too much, asked a simple arithmetic question, his voice steady. She snapped at him, sharp and uncharacteristic. Her cheeks flushed. The children grew silent. For the first time, they glimpsed not the nurturing schoolteacher, but something brittle, something strained, and then the cellar door. One evening, a young man delivering coal passed Maggie's home and noticed the door ajar. He swore he saw sacks, too many, too large, stacked in the shadows. When he mentioned it at the tavern, men laughed. "Old Maggie's hoarding turnips for winter," they said. But the boy's voice trembled as he insisted, "Those weren't turnips." None of these slips alone would have condemned her, but whispers, once seated, grow stubborn root. And in a town that prized appearances, even a crack in the mask was enough to let the darker truths seep through. Every dark tale eventually stirs a figure who refuses to look away. In this story, that figure was Thomas Whitaker, a young deputy barely into his 30s, carrying both ambition and scars from his own past. He was not the town's most respected officer, nor the most experienced, but he possessed something far rarer in that close-knit Kentucky community, a restless suspicion. Thomas had grown up nearby, the son of a coal miner who died in a cave-in that the company had called an accident. He'd seen firsthand how truth could be buried beneath official words, how ordinary folk were expected to swallow grief without question. That bitterness followed him into law enforcement, where he carried a private vow. Never again would he allow silence to masquerade as justice. When whispers about Maggie Halloway reached his ears, the stew that smelled wrong, the missing drifters, the boy too afraid to sleep, Thomas did not laugh them off as others did. He took notes. He asked questions quietly, gently, as though weaving a net no one else realized was being strung. At the tavern, men scoffed, Whitaker's chasing ghosts. But he saw patterns others ignored. There was also something personal. His own niece sat daily in Maggie's classroom. Each evening, when the girl came home chattering about Miss Halloway's wonderful pies or the funny stew we had at lunch, Thomas felt a knot tighten in his chest. It was one thing to hear rumors of strangers disappearing. It was another to imagine his family seated at that table. Yet Thomas was no fearless crusader. He was flawed, haunted by self-doubt, and acutely aware of how easily the town could turn on him. To accuse Maggie, the cherished teacher, without proof would mean exile, maybe ruin. Still, he knew the first step had already been taken. By listening, by refusing to dismiss, he had crossed the invisible line between comfort and danger. Heroes rarely look heroic in the beginning. More often, they look like a man carrying a notebook, standing at the edge of a shadow he knows he cannot unsee. Thomas Whitaker knew that blunt accusations would only seal his fate. If he was to expose Margaret Halloway, he needed to move like smoke, quiet, unseen, yet persistent enough to seep through the cracks of her lies. And so, he began the dangerous task of inserting himself into her world, all under the guise of duty and neighborly concern. His first step was routine, or so it seemed. He stopped by the schoolhouse on official business, claiming to check on attendance records for new state requirements. Maggie, ever the poised schoolteacher, welcomed him warmly. She even offered him a seat at the back while she conducted her lessons. To anyone else, it was an innocent gesture. To Thomas, it was a chance to observe. He noticed how she controlled the room, not just with kindness, but with subtle authority. The children adored her, yes, but they also feared disappointing her. That fear, he realized, ran deeper than respect. He returned again under different pretenses, sometimes to discuss petty thefts in the area, sometimes to drop off official notices. Each time, he paid close attention to her routines, when she locked the cellar door, how often she carried parcels wrapped in cloth, why the stew pot seemed to simmer endlessly even when no community meal was scheduled. Thomas also listened to the children. He lingered after class, casually asking them about their favorite dishes, their lessons, their games. Small details emerged. Samuel's nightmares, a girl whispering that Miss Halloway never lets us peek in the pantry, another swearing that Maggie sometimes hummed strange lullabies while stirring her pot. None of it was proof, but together it formed a portrait that unsettled him more with each passing day. The danger, of course, was proximity. Maggie was no fool. She began to notice his visits, her eyes lingering on him longer than before, her smiles a shade too tight, And two, oh, she said nothing. Thomas felt the shift. He was no longer a harmless deputy with a notebook. He had become a fly daring to touch the web. And Maggie Halloway was the kind of spider who never allowed flies to leave. Now, pause with me for just a moment. We've walked together through whispers, shadows, and uneasy glances, but from this point forward, the story descends into far darker territory. What comes next is not just unsettling. It is the kind of truth that clings to you, that follows you into the quiet hours of the night when the house creaks and your mind replays every detail. I need to ask you, are you ready to keep going? Because this is where the facade shatters, where Maggie Halloway's secrets stop being rumor and become undeniable horror. From here on, nothing is safe. Not the schoolhouse, not the children, not even the investigators who dared to get too close. If your heart is steady, if your curiosity outweighs your fear, then stay with me. But I'll warn you now, once you hear the truth, you cannot unhear it. And the question you must carry with you is this: what would you have done had you lived in that town, in that year, with that stew simmering before you? It happened on a rain-soaked evening when the streets of Claybrook glistened under the faint glow of gas lamps. Thomas Whitaker had grown restless, certain that watching from a distance was no longer enough. He needed something tangible, something that would rip Maggie's mask from her face once and for all. That chance came unexpectedly. He followed her discreetly after dusk, when most of the town had shuttered for the night. She carried a basket, heavy and shrouded in cloth, toward the schoolhouse. Thomas kept to the shadows, his boots sinking into the mud. He watched her vanish inside, candlelight flickering through the classroom window. Moments later, the unmistakable scent of stew drifted into the damp night air, but this time, mingled within the herbs and onions, was the sharp, unmistakable odor of decay. Heart pounding, Thomas forced the cellar door. The hinges groaned, but the storm covered the sound. What he found below turned his suspicion into certainty. Bundles of clothing, children's shoes, a farmer's hat, scraps of fabric lay piled in the corner, damp and dark with stains that no wash could erase. And on the butcher's block, beneath a cloth that slipped too easily, rested cuts of flesh that were not from any animal known to him. For a long moment, Thomas could only stand there, the bile rising in his throat, his lantern trembling in his hand. He had asked for proof. Now he had it. But proof, he realized, came at a price. Maggie would know someone had been in her cellar. And when a spider senses her web disturbed, she does not wait to strike. She hunts. The lantern's flame flickered wildly as Thomas backed toward the cellar stairs, every instinct screaming to run. But before he could steady himself, a sound froze him in place. The creak of the schoolhouse door above. Maggie had returned. Her footsteps descended slowly, deliberately, each one echoing off the stone walls like the toll of a bell. Thomas snuffed the lantern and pressed himself into the shadows, holding his breath as her candlelight spread across the cellar. She hummed softly, the same eerie lullaby the children had whispered about, her free hand brushing across the sacks of grain, the hanging herbs, the bundles that were not what they seemed. Then she stopped, her head tilted. "Who's there?" Thomas bolted. In an instant, the cellar erupted with the crash of glass jars and the clatter of iron pots as Maggie lunged after him. He tore through the schoolhouse, shoving past desks and leaping over benches, her footsteps fast and unrelenting behind him. Rain hammered the windows, thunder splitting the sky as he threw the door wide and plunged into the storm. Maggie followed, her figure a dark silhouette against the lightning, her skirts whipping around her like wings. He sprinted down the muddy lane, lungs burning, the image of that cellar seared into his mind. Each glance back showed her closer, impossibly swift, her face a mask of fury that the townsfolk had never seen. At last, the lights of the tavern flickered ahead. With a final surge, Thomas burst inside, soaked and gasping, while the door slammed shut behind him. Maggie's shadow lingered in the rain, watching, waiting. The chase was over for now, but the war had just begun. The tavern fell silent the moment Thomas burst inside, soaked to the bone. Mud splattered across his boots, his eyes wide with something far beyond fear. Men turned from their cards, women from their suppers. He slammed his fists on the bar and gasped, "It's her, Maggie Halloway, the cellar. God help me, you have to see it." For a moment, the room hung suspended in disbelief. Then came the laughter, uneasy at first, then rolling like thunder. Old Mr. Harper shook his head. "Tom, you been drinking?" Another chimed in. "Maggie, that saint of a woman. She teaches our children, feeds half the town. You've lost your senses." Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking. He described the clothing, the butcher's block, the stench that no venison could explain. But the more he spoke, the more resistance hardened. The townsfolk did not want to hear. To accept his words meant accepting that the woman who tucked their children into safety each day was capable of unthinkable evil. Denial, Thomas realized, was easier than truth. Finally, the tavern keeper clapped him on the shoulder, guiding him toward the door. "You're tired, deputy. Take rest. Don't go slandering good folks." And just like that, his desperate warning dissolved into smoke. Outside, the storm still raged, and Thomas stood alone under the awning, his heart sinking. Through the sheets of rain, he thought he glimpsed her, Maggie, watching from the edge of the lane, her figure unmoving, her face unreadable. The town would not save itself, and if he failed, neither would the children. It took days of relentless persistence before Thomas finally convinced the sheriff to act. He returned to the schoolhouse with a posse of deputies and a handful of uneasy townsmen, their lanterns cutting through the gray morning mist. Even then, many muttered doubts. "We'll find nothing," one said. "Poor Tom's lost in ghost stories." But when the cellar door groaned open under their boots, silence fell. The air struck them first, thick, cloying, unmistakably wrong. One man gagged, pressing a handkerchief to his face. Their lanterns revealed the truth Thomas had seen. Piles of garments, shoes, and personal effects scattered like discarded shells. A rosary, a child's ribbon, a farmer's hat streaked with dark stains. The butcher's block stood in the center, its surface carved deep with grooves, as though it had been used again and again. And then, the stew. The pot simmered quietly on the stove above, as though awaiting its next serving. Inside floated chunks of meat that no one dared to name. One deputy whispered a prayer. Another dropped his lantern, shattering it on the floor. The sheriff, pale as chalk, barked for men to search further. They uncovered shallow graves beyond the schoolhouse yard, crude and hurried, the earth still damp where it had been disturbed. Bones protruded, fragile, human. There was no laughter now, no denial left to cling to. The truth lay bare in the reeking cellar, undeniable and obscene. Margaret Halloway, the beloved schoolteacher, had built her legacy on horror. And for the first time, the town saw her not as a caretaker, but as the monster who had lived among them, smiling all the while. When the cellar doors opened, the town's illusions collapsed. Margaret Halloway, once praised as the gentle schoolteacher, the woman who fed the hungry and soothed the grieving, was now laid bare as something altogether different. But the question lingered. Who was she, really? Digging into her past revealed a story few had ever known. Margaret had not been born in Claybrook. She arrived years earlier from a neighboring county, carrying only a trunk and a letter of recommendation that, in hindsight, seemed forged. Those who remembered her youth spoke of a girl with a quick wit but a cruel streak, one who delighted in manipulating others, one who left abruptly after rumors of strange disappearances near her boarding house. Further digging unearthed whispers of accomplices. A drifter she had once taken in, known only as Elijah, had vanished shortly after staying in her home. Some believed he helped her in her earliest crimes, perhaps even teaching her how to butcher and preserve flesh in ways that masked its origins. Whether he became victim or partner remained a mystery, his fate swallowed by her growing hunger. In Claybrook, Maggie's villainy thrived because it was cloaked in kindness. She had learned to wear goodness like a second skin. Her warm smile, her motherly manner, her endless stew pot. The townsfolk realized, with a sickening twist of the stomach, that their trust had been her weapon. She had built her power not through force, but through faith. faith they had given willingly. Now, unmasked, she stood revealed as both predator and deceiver, a woman whose crimes thrived because no one dared to imagine such darkness could wear such a gentle face. At first, the people of Claybrook wanted to believe Maggie's horrors ended at the edge of their schoolhouse. But as investigators widened their search, a darker truth emerged. Her crimes were not confined to a single town. Threads stretched outward, linking her deeds to a larger, unsettling pattern. Newspapers from nearby counties carried reports eerily similar. Transient laborers vanishing without trace, families grieving loved ones who had simply wandered off. Records from a Louisville orphanage noted sudden disappearances of children, 2 of whom had briefly boarded with a Miss H before being declared runaways. Each story on its own seemed tragic but isolated. Together, they painted a chilling map of predation. And then came the letters. Among Maggie's belongings were correspondences written in a firm, unfamiliar hand, discussing shipments, supplies, and payments for special cuts. These were not the words of a solitary madwoman. They suggested trade, secrecy, and partners who benefited from her work. Some speculated she supplied meat to black markets in nearby cities, disguising it as pork or venison. Others whispered of secret societies, grotesque gatherings where wealthy patrons indulged in forbidden tastes. The scope left Claybrook reeling. Their beloved schoolteacher was no mere anomaly. She was a cog in something far wider. If true, her kitchen was only one branch of a network stretching beyond Kentucky's borders. The investigation raised a question far more terrifying than Maggie herself. How many others like her existed, wearing kind faces, stirring familiar pots, hiding their horrors in plain sight? The revelations should have shattered Claybrook to its core. Instead, a strange quiet settled over the town, like a blanket drawn too tightly. Whispers hushed when strangers passed. Newspapers softened their language, calling Maggie's deeds disturbances rather than atrocities. Families who had lost loved ones suddenly stopped speaking their names in public. It wasn't forgetfulness, it was survival. Acknowledging the full horror threatened more than reputations. It threatened the very fabric of the community. Admitting that a trusted teacher had fed children the flesh of their neighbors meant facing the unbearable truth. They had all been complicit in their blindness. Parents remembered empty chairs at supper, yet still sent their children to Maggie's classroom. The pastor recalled her generous donations, but never asked from where they came. Even the sheriff, who now claimed courage, had once laughed off suspicions with a wave of his hand. Behind closed doors, some townsfolk begged authorities to bury the details. Others feared economic ruin. Who would move to Claybrook if its name became synonymous with cannibalism? And so, an unofficial pact was struck. Silence. Officials promised to protect the community from shame. Witnesses were dismissed as hysterical. The most damning evidence was sealed away. Generations later, the conspiracy still lingered. Diaries vanished. Archives were redacted. Stories softened into folklore. Claybrook's survival depended on selective memory. But silence does not erase truth. It only drives it deeper into the soil, where it waits, like bones underfoot, for someone brave enough to dig it up again. When the dust settled, the people of Claybrook looked not just at the crimes, but at those forever marked by them. Maggie Halloway, the teacher once praised for her kindness, was hauled to trial under a heavy veil of secrecy. Yet her courtroom never became the spectacle it should have been. Behind closed doors, with jurors hand-picked for their loyalty, the verdict was swift. Guilty on lesser charges, her worst sins left unspoken. She was quietly sentenced to life imprisonment, but rumors followed, of wealthy benefactors ensuring her comfort, of late-night transfers that placed her in institutions far from Kentucky, where records grew strangely thin. Thomas Avery, the young man who had risked everything to expose her, carried scars that never healed. Though he escaped with his life, his testimony was doubted, his reputation stained by whispers of exaggeration. He left Claybrook, drifting town to town, never fully free of what he had seen. Some claimed he wrote letters warning others, though few believed them. The collaborators fared differently. The sheriff, once accused of turning a blind eye, finished his term and retired quietly, untouched by justice. Church leaders who had praised Maggie's charity doubled down on their piety, erasing her name from sermons, but never acknowledging their silence. And the children, the ones who once sat at her tables, who unknowingly consumed her meals, grew into adults who rarely spoke of their past. Some left Kentucky altogether, chasing distance from the memories that stalked them. The fate of the key players was not one of resolution, but of shadows. Justice was partial, truth was diluted, and the echoes of Maggie's kitchen never truly left them. Stories like Maggie Halloway's do not fade easily. They linger in the corners of history, where the official record grows faint, but memory still breathes. Claybrook may have buried her name beneath silence, yet the legacy of her crime seeped outward like a stain no one could scrub away. The lesson was not only about one woman's hunger or cruelty, it was about the cost of blindness. A community chose comfort over confrontation. Parents trusted too easily. Leaders excused too quickly. And by the time the truth clawed its way into daylight, too many lives had already been lost. For generations, people passed the story in whispers, cautioning children not to take kindness at face value, not to mistake warm meals or gentle smiles for innocence. It became a parable of vigilance, though softened into folklore, the teacher's stew, so the weight of its truth could be borne. But the moral cuts deeper still. Evil rarely arrives as a monster with sharp teeth. More often, it comes dressed as a neighbor, a mentor, a caregiver, someone who knows how to win trust before betraying it. Maggie was not the only one of her kind, merely one who was caught. The legacy of Claybrook warns us that silence is complicity, that the refusal to ask questions is as dangerous as the crime itself. And perhaps most haunting of all, it reminds us that the darkest acts in history were often served on familiar plates, in ordinary rooms, under the watchful eyes of those who should have known better. So here we are, at the edge of the tale, yet the shadows of Claybrook still reach toward us. Maggie Halloway may be gone, her schoolhouse abandoned, her kitchen long cold, but the lesson she leaves behind is not confined to history. It is a warning meant for us, here and now. Because evil rarely announces itself. It slips quietly into trusted spaces, behind smiling faces, inside respected roles. And when a community chooses to look away, when institutions prize reputation over truth, the ground is laid for horrors to take root once more. Silence is not safety. Silence is permission. And so I ask you, if you had lived in that town, would you have spoken up? Would you have believed the frightened witness or dismissed them for the comfort of denial? These are not questions of the past. They are questions for today, because somewhere, in some quiet corner of our world, another Maggie may already be at work, hidden in plain sight. The story of Claybrook ends in ashes, but yours does not have to. Carry its lesson. Ask the questions others fear. Do not let politeness bury the truth. And remember, this was only one story, one teacher, one small town. In the vaults of forgotten history, countless others wait, their secrets still sealed. If you dare, return with me again, and we will open another door together. Until then, watch closely. Evil is always nearer than you think.